So I'm Sara Brumfield. This is my partner, Ben, and we're with From the Page. And we wanted to tell you what we've learned over a decade of running crowdsourcing projects. Next slide.
Yes, this focus is going to talk about the soft skills required to run projects, especially for institutions who want to engage the public and volunteers to work on their material.
We'll send out a resource list with links to everything that we mentioned during today's webinar, so you don't have to scramble to write things down. We're also recording this, and we'll send out a link to that if you want to share it with any colleagues. What we're going to go over is kind of who are we and what From the Page is, what's effective crowdsourcing, thinking about volunteers, selecting material, developing transcription conventions, kicking off projects, and keeping volunteers engaged. After we kind of go through that, that'll be about half an hour's worth of material. We'll do a show and tell from the page, and you can ask questions. Actually, we'll do questions first, and then we'll kind of do a demo.
Okay, so let's get started. So as Sara mentioned, we run a crowdsourcing platform called From the Page. So there's lots of different kinds of crowdsourcing tasks that cultural heritage institutions run, from eBird to iNaturalist or things like that. We focus on archival documents. We focus on materials that you find in library special collections, in archives, which could be private, public, all kinds of sizes. Everyone has handwritten material. So we're going to talk about that and focus on it, but we think that the lessons that we've learned also can apply to other kinds of crowdsourcing tasks as well.
Like photo identification or geo-rectifying maps, which are kind of outside of what we do, but yeah.
So in terms of what we do, briefly, our platform lets people see the image of a page and transcribe the text from that page. We try to keep the technology as simple as possible for users, because transcribing historic text is hard enough. It really, really is a difficult intellectual exercise, and we don't want to clutter that up with a layer of technology on top of that. So we've seen a lot of successful projects over the last few years. Here are a handful of the institutions who've worked with us. But okay, so enough about that. Let's talk about effective crowdsourcing. So in our opinion, effective crowdsourcing is a collaboration between an institution and the public. And the goal is deep public engagement with, in our case, special collections and archives. So
not the only goal, but
that is one of the
goals.
Yeah. So when I say deep engagement, let me clarify that. So a lot of organizations have a social media presence nowadays, Instagram accounts, Facebook groups, things like that, that let them expose their material more broadly to the public. And that's really, really wonderful for broad engagement. Right, you see material reaching people it would not otherwise, but that engagement can be really shallow, right? In some cases, it's just limited to pressing a like button or retweeting something. There's not a real opportunity for members of the public to contribute their own passion and their own knowledge back to the institution, right? It's not a real collaboration. So in addition to being about public engagement, crowdsourcing is about improving metadata for digitized assets in ways that require massive amounts of human interpretation. This is stuff that library and archives, museum staff typically don't have within their job description, don't have within their resources to go in and do something like this, transcribe every page of an orchidology book. It doesn't mean we're not talking about massive amounts of material or massive numbers of volunteers. This example was all done by one user.
What's interesting about this is from the Chicago Botanic Library, and it was an orchidologist notebook, and it was written in German, and it wasn't very text dense, but in order to transcribe this, you needed to know a decent amount of German. You probably needed to know something about orchids, and you probably needed to be pretty familiar with a lot of the Latin that is used to describe the genus and species of different orchids. So that's a lot of human interpretation. It took a very specialized set of skills to do it, but it didn't produce a tremendous amount of text, nor did it take a tremendous amount of people.
It took one really devoted volunteer who likes orchids and could hack their way through the German.
When we talk about actually,
yeah, so
sorry.
so when we talk about archival staff, effective crowdsourcing, in our opinion, is only possible with the guidance and engagement of trained information professionals, right? Crowdsourcing sometimes gets a rap where people think, oh, well, it's free labor. You're asking the public to do your job for you. That's never going to work. That is absolutely going to fall on its head.
We have a cute picture of a puppy here because we have a standing joke that crowdsourcing is not free as in speech or free as in beer, but it's free as in puppy. The puppy is free, but you have to take care of it, right? You have a lot of work to do. Volunteers that are participating in these projects don't like to be ignored. They don't like having their work lost. You're doing something that they feel is meaningful and they're engaging with you, and therefore your job is to make sure that their work is meaningful and engage with them. So we're going to talk about the work that goes into successful crowdsourcing projects. Let's start with volunteers, because if you don't have volunteers, you're not going to have a successful crowdsourcing project, right? So this is actually a picture of some of the Library of Virginia's volunteers at their annual Transcribiversary. I love how diverse they are. We know that a lot of our volunteers tend to skew older. Retirees love these projects, but Library of Virginia actually has a lot of students that work with them as well. And so when you start a project like this, you start thinking about a project like this, you should start by thinking, where can we find volunteers? Who will they be? Do we already have volunteers who work with our institution? Maybe you have people who are local who are interested. If you have material that's local, your local historical societies, your local genealogists would probably be very interested in working with you. Maybe you're deep on a particular subject matter and you can reach out to communities around that subject matter. One of the early projects we did with the Yaquina Head lighthouses off the coast of Oregon, they had lighthouse keepers logs over decades, and they were able to engage with lighthouse fans. It turns out there's a lot of people out there who are very enthusiastic about lighthouses, and to have those people come in virtually and work on transcribing was very fun for them, but also effective as a crowdsourcing approach. Not everyone is going to have as many volunteers or run an annual Transcribiversary like Library of Virginia does, but I think it's worth thinking about where your volunteers come from. Go ahead, next slide. When you think about volunteers, you should also think about what material has been most popular with your patrons and think about why it's popular. So this image is of a volunteer with the Missouri State Archives holding her grandfather's birth certificate. Genealogists love projects with lots of names and vital information, even if the material isn't as engaging as diaries or letters. The last thing to realize is that crowdsourcing is not something that you're familiar with, but it's something your volunteers may not be familiar with either. It's a bit intimidating, right? So if you think through how you make it easier for them, that puts you in a good mindset for working with your volunteers. When you run projects on FromThePage, we also send out a monthly newsletter that features new projects. And if you want us to include yours, we can. And what we see is that volunteers and transcribers get really into this type of work because it's fun and it's engaging. The image on the screen represents the most active transcribers on 3 different projects from the Indiana Archives, the Library of Virginia, and the California State Library. And these projects actually all were World War I projects, different types of material, but all related to World War I. What you see is that while the bulk of their active transcribers were independent, only worked on their projects, there were overlaps. There are volunteers who go from project to project. We have one volunteer who about once a month will scroll through our list of projects looking for something she hasn't worked on and then hop in and try something new. It's kind of fascinating because sometimes she finds something she's really interested in and goes deep and contributes a lot, and sometimes she does a page or two and moves on.
So how do you figure out what kind of material is appropriate for crowdsourcing? Now, success does come in many forms. Volunteers are motivated by many different things, so not everyone is motivated by the same thing. There's many different kinds of success. So what we want to look for is material that can tell good stories. this is one of the criteria we look for, right? If you have material that once you start reading it, you really want to turn the page and find out what happens next. That's what we're talking about. So letters, diaries have this great kind of intrinsic motivation for people to keep transcribing. People get involved in the story and they feel good about coming back to it because they want to know what's going to happen in the next month, the next week, the next letter exchange. So that can provide a really good and immersive experience. Narratives are not the only way to provide an immersive experience, though. We've seen that from, say, World War I service cards, where you have a card for each service member who was in World War I, and how old people are transcribing them. There's no narrative there, right? But the people working on this get a snapshot of a community, of the age of people, of where they served, of what branch they were in, and it takes them back to, say, 1918. You can also be successful with material that has a lot of local history or genealogy. The Indianapolis Public Library ran a project transcribing records from Indianapolis public schools that, I've got to say, seems dry as dust. It's just lists of students' names, who their parents are, when they enrolled, where they moved from, or if they were de-enrolling, where they were moving to. It's dry stuff, but it's a genealogical gold mine, and volunteers understood that, right? They got they understand that this is something that can solve people get through their own brick walls, and so they're highly motivated to help with this.
We also find that if you can give your volunteers a sense of accomplishment, that's very, very motivating. Actually, easy material is very motivating because you're like, oh, I'm getting stuff done. I think we're all motivated by checking things off a list. So some of the reasons the World War I service card projects were so successful is because you had a single card. And the Alabama Department of Archives and History did the first of these projects, and they only collected about 5 fields from each card, so a transcriber could get a lot done. They all like to get the stuff done. That feeling of accomplishment kept them coming back. That particular project was 111,000 World War I service cards, and they transcribed them in 2.5 months. Because their material hit so many of these points, because they had such great relationships with their local genealogy and history organizations, it was a super successful project.
So the next thing we talk about is developing instructions, right? And for transcription projects, that means developing transcription conventions. What those are instructions for people who are working with the text. Once they run into problems, here's how to deal with them. And the minute that anyone encounters an abbreviation or a non-standard spelling or a word that's unclear to read, they're going to have questions about what to do about that. So we encourage projects to develop transcription conventions that answer those kinds of questions. And we actually show those on the transcription screen itself. So it's right underneath the field that people are typing into. This is an example here on the left-hand side of the slide from the Wisconsin Historical Society. And it's a great example. You can see, they're dealing with a lot of different scenarios here. One of the things that we recommend for developing instructions is that you go ahead and transcribe some example pages. You can upload them as a separate section, you can link to them, and those can serve as examples, right? Those can serve as ways that people can see, oh, okay, well, that's what they did, right? Not everyone wants to read the manual, but sometimes they want to see what you did. While you're doing those examples, take notes of the problems you run into, right? Those are great things to add to your instructions. As you work through projects, you can iterate, you can improve things, you can add new questions as people encounter stuff that maybe you weren't aware existed in your documents. The last thing I recommend is that as you're developing these instructions, if you can go find staff members who are not familiar with the documents and ask them to transcribe them, listen to the questions that they ask. Right, that gives you a great opportunity, especially if you're yourself, very familiar with the documents, very embedded. It gives you an opportunity to see what someone new to these is going to run into and address those questions. So, getting people together to transcribe documents is not just a good way to create instructions, but it's also a great way to launch your projects. So Library of Virginia does 2 transcribathons per month, but you don't have to do that, right? You can just launch one at the very beginning of your project, bring in the people who you think could be leaders within the field or their community, people who are active in genealogy or heritage or historical organizations, and do an in-person transcribathon. So that lets you give hands-on instruction to people, get them over the hump and the discomfort of, what am I doing here? Is my work good enough? What on earth did this scribe's hand say, right? You could kind of get them through the difficulty of the particular cursive you might be working with. The other thing that they're great for is a little bit of publicity. In addition to the people who attend being able to come home and share their experience with people in their communities, we also see a little bit of coverage, right? These 2 examples I find are interesting because they're not launched by the people who ran the transcribathon. The New Orleans Jazz Museum ran one, but you see this post is up by the French department at Tulane saying anybody in New Orleans who's interested in French maybe should come do this and work with colonial French documents. On the right-hand side, we see a social media post by a participant at a transcribathon saying, check it out, this is so cool, I'm learning how to read medieval Latin. So that spreads the word even more. Remote transcribathons are also possible. One of the ones, the Library of Virginia does 1 in person and 1 remote every month. We will say that the communication barrier to remote transcribathons is higher, but having a video conference to walk people through a project, that can work, and it can work especially with kind of motivated tech-savvy volunteers. This example is a transcribathon for medievalists that was held in conjunction with a conference at the Schoenberg Institute of Manuscript Studies. So that transcribathons are not the only way to kick off a new project.
Even if you don't do a transcribathon, which you don't have to do, not everyone has the facility and the space to do that, but you should definitely do some outreach and marketing. What we tend to say is that your best volunteers are ones that already have a tie to your institution or to your location or to your material. And then we kind of go broader, people who are active on FromThePage and who just love these types of projects. But generally, the first group is your best volunteers, just because they have loyalty to you and they want to work with your institution. So you should do some outreach and some marketing. So your existing outreach venues like mailing lists or social media accounts, you should definitely use those and mention your project. You have a physical location, you can do handouts like at a checkout desk or as you walk in a door. You can also look for subject matter enthusiast communities, people who would be interested in the material and might not be local. We find that expats, even if they're just people who grew up in an area and moved 500 miles away, often feel a very strong sense of loyalty and are looking for that connection to your location. On Facebook or Twitter accounts, there's magazines, there's lots of different ways to help find organizations and groups of people who might be interested in a particular subject. And that will actually be, we have a blog post about that will go out in the follow-up email. We've also seen a lot of local news channels, both print and television, pick up these projects because they're interesting and they're visual. You've got cool old documents, you have people they can come in and take pictures of, and they're feel-good stories. They're a way for the local community, for retirees to contribute to your mission of preserving memories. So this is coverage by a local TV station of a project from the Seattle Municipal Archives. And they came in and filmed Jeannie Fisher, who's the reference archivist there, like in her archive. You can see all of the municipal records behind her, and I think it makes for beautiful television, but it also makes for great coverage of your project. We also see that newspapers will pick these projects up. So when the North Carolina State Archives launched their Colonial Court Records project, they had coverage in 2 large newspapers. It happened to be around the holidays, which are slow news days, and it brought in a lot of interested volunteers. Those days were actually the highest number of visits to FromThePage's website that year, because people were at home, they were looking for interesting things to talk about and do together, and there was this newspaper coverage of this project. Once you kick off a project and you're starting to get volunteers working on it, you need to keep them engaged. So it's not unusual for volunteers to drop by, transcribe a page, and you may never see them again. So we have a couple of suggestions for keeping those volunteers engaged. The more you can keep, the more you'll accomplish. So the first suggestion is to welcome new users. We send out a note every night to project owners telling them what's gone on in their collection the previous day. You'll get something like the screenshot at the bottom where it shows the name of someone who joined your particular project. You can go into your collaborators tab and see people who join, and you can grab their email addresses if they opt in and send them an email. A stock email is fine, and tell them what the project is, what the purpose is. Volunteers really like purpose. And what's the transcribed material going to be used for? If you have any training materials, or you can link to videos that we produce that kind of help people get started. You can link to your help tabs, your transcription conventions. You also include how to contact you. You want them to be able to ask you questions or share something cool that they found, or see if they can bring in a group of 20 people to help you transcribe, and all of those things. You want them to be able to find you. So you want to make it easy. And what we've seen is if they can't find you, they find us, and we can't always answer their questions. So in addition to welcoming new users, that nightly email will also include comments and questions from collaborators, from the volunteers who are transcribing for you.
So you see an example on the right-hand side of the screen of comments, right? So this is something that shows up in the nightly email. And these are the kinds of things that we saw with a project that we ran. A lot of volunteer comments will not necessarily be questions. They might be just additional research of material that the volunteers have found and looked up and said, wow, okay, here's exactly what's going on. Here's what this strange term means. Here's who this person is. This is what I mean when I talk about this being this kind of grand collaboration. This is great stuff. On the left-hand side, this is an example from the Yakina Head Lighthouses. This is a conversation that happens on the page itself. On our system, we try to have comments under each page so that if people are having trouble deciphering a word, the conversation happens in the context of the image and the text. So you see a post initially by the volunteer Olivia saying, at the lighthouse, they're doing all this stuff with a hack. They're cleaning it, they're varnishing it, they're painting it. What is a hack? Now, the fact that she left that message meant that in the next morning, the people running the account, the friends of the Yakina Head Lighthouses, got in their morning email her question. And they did a great thing. They responded immediately. Of course, they also didn't know what a hack was, right? But it's important to respond to let people know that their question has been heard. So this is actually a best practice, and them posting a response here meant that she got an email with their response, and the next day later, they did a little bit more research. They looked up hack boat and found out that it's just sort of a general purpose boat that would totally be useful on a lighthouse. So this strange vocabulary word was resolved.
The other thing that we recommend is that you include your contact information. So we have a footer that you can configure that shows up on the bottom of every page of your project. This is from the LA County Library, and they link to their Facebook, where they are on Twitter and Instagram. And that questions contact us is actually a mail to form where you can email them if you have questions. So that's a really great way to kind of help people find you, because not everyone is willing to ask questions in public, right? We don't always like looking stupid in public. So having some alternative ways for them to get in touch with you is great. The last thing we recommend is that you send a newsletter. It doesn't have to be complicated or big. Doing something as often as is feasible for you. We kind of recommend once a month, but if you only get it out once a quarter, that's okay too. You kind of need to jumpstart your project again because it's volunteers have fallen off. You can send it then. You can pull a list of all of your collaborator emails from the project owner view and from the page, and you can just paste them into your email client, or if you use something fancy like MailChimp or Constant Contact, you can pull them into there. We have blog posts that have a lot of examples of what different people will do for crowdsourcing project newsletters. Lots of really cool ideas. You feature neat things people found. Oh, here's a shipwreck that landed at the lighthouse, or people hitting milestones of so-and-so has transcribed 100 pages, 500 pages of, you know, whatever you have, or just there's lots of ways to build community and make that feeling of success and being part of something cool really resonate by sending a newsletter. So that's all the formal presentation that we have for you today. But if you're interested in starting a crowdsourcing project, we have a free trial that you can do for 200 pages. It's really designed for you to kick the tires and figure out how FromThePage works and what you can do with it. The URL here is for the new trial. We'll actually send out the resources that I mentioned in a follow-up email.
So that's the end of our presentation. I'm going to stop sharing and open up the floor for questions, comments, discussion. Feel free to either unmute yourself and ask something, or if you're a little shyer or you have AV issues, if you type something in the chat, then we'll respond to it there.
Yeah.
And Mona, thank you for leaving your camera on. It's such a relief to a presenter.
And thank you, Tara, for the compliment.
Yes.
In the chat. That's always nice. That chat is open and you're welcome to ask questions. I think if we we want to wait enough time for you to ask questions, but then Ben's going to kind of share his screen and we'll walk you through some from the page.
Nobody has any questions. Oh, there we go.
Yay.
Can we talk about limiting a transcription project to a select group of transcribers? Excellent. Yes, we can. So crowdsourcing projects don't have to be public, or they don't have to be an open call. They can be public without being an open call. Let me kind of walk through what that may be. Projects may be maybe entirely private. So that happens for different reasons. One example is, so we did some work with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe who were working on material written in the Lakota and Dakota languages as part of a language revitalization project. And they really wanted to limit participation there to members of the Sioux tribe. And so they ran a private project, really not visible to anyone, that was very closed. So they set the project to private, they had their transcribers and added them, and those people were the only ones able to see it.
From a technical point of view, you set the project to private, people have to sign up for a FromThePage account, and then you can look them up by their email address and add them to be able to collaborate on your project.
Another example that's a little more open is one happening at the Archives of Michigan that is working with a statewide heritage organization, the Daughters of the American Revolution, to transcribe World War I service cards. This is a private project, but it has a massive amount of participation by the members of the DAR, all of whom I believe compete chapter by chapter with each other on number of volunteer hours, and having a remote volunteer opportunity is very powerful. These ladies are extremely competitive, and
they're getting stuff done.
They're getting a lot of stuff done.
Michigan is running as hard as they can to keep up with them.
Yeah, it is. The archivist of Michigan is fighting really hard to run the scanners all day long to try to get through these, because she posts a few hundred or thousand things in the morning, and by lunchtime they're done. It's just pretty amazing. Other projects are run as private projects because they want potential volunteer. They'll accept anyone, but they want people to either go through training or agree to some terms. And some of these, for example, are projects working with material that's still under copyright. So the letters of authors that are still technically owned by members of the literary estate. In those cases, they want the volunteers working on them to agree to, not share them or certain copyright restrictions before they allow them in.
We also see some projects that are kind of public for a transcription phase and then private for an annotation and editing phase. They tend to be scholarly projects. So they have the public do transcription, and then they have research associates do kind of the editing and the annotation of the documents. So that's kind of another example.
Right. And part of the reason for that is quality control, because they want the research assistants typically are grad students in history who are trained on doing a lot of database work. One of the things I find most amusing about that model is that the research assistants are the experts, but it turns out the volunteers are a lot better at reading the handwriting than the 20 and 30-year-old grad students are. So the volunteers during the crowdsourcing phase are actually the experts on that side of things too. So it's a really neat kind of collaboration to see people coming together like that. Any other questions? Students have a hard time reading cursive writing.
Yeah.
Yes, they do.
But what we've seen, so I think my favorite example here is Baylor University used FromThePage in a freshman history majors class. So kind of a first history class, but for people who wanted to major in history. And the archivist and the professor collaborated to find some material that was local. It was the Waco settlement home movement from the 1910s. And what they did is the archivist came in and pulled up from the page on the screen and started transcribing. And it's hard, right? Even with the 1910s, you make mistakes and you don't get it perfect, but it's a puzzle, and people start engaging with the puzzle aspect of it. And they started working together in the classroom to do that. And then they broke the students up into like pairs and smaller groups and had them work through material, because you don't want to feel like people are insecure when they don't know what they're doing, but it's a skill, right? And we build skills. This is one of the things that you do, especially for learning new things. And so, a lot of times what we see is even students can get over that hump if they have some motivation, and you kind of handhold them and teach them, right? You give them some skills. One of the things we are actually brainstorming on right now is producing some paleography classes, but even for like 20th century paleography, like here's how you read a letter, here's how you read a telegram, which is not even handwriting, but still, these are forms that we don't all know. And the younger you are, the kind of less likely you are to know.
Part of the your point about the local Black cemetery and burial rosters, we've done some work with the Frederick Douglass Memorial Park on Staten Island. And they've run something similar. You've got interment logs, you've got these things. One of the interesting things about this is you don't necessarily only have to teach students the cursive writing, you also have to teach them a little bit about the form of the document, right? What is a burial roster? It is a challenge, right? It is, I think, a little easier than cuneiform, but only once you get used to it.
The other thing that we've seen that is actually really successful, especially with like indigenous languages that only people who are elders within that community perhaps know, but those people aren't tech savvy, right? They're not always comfortable working on computers and interacting with software, is to pair them with a younger partner. And then kind of your younger partner is your keyboard jockey, and your elder is your expert on the material. And so together they work really well.
Yeah, we've seen that, those held at public libraries, for example, that have computer labs, they're pretty cool. Other questions or comments? This is great.
Yeah, I'd much rather tell stories than show off software, but we'll do both.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to share my screen, but I do encourage you to interrupt either using the chat or just unmuting yourself. Sarah and I interrupt each other all the time, so you should feel free to do the same. And I've just got kind of an informal live demo that I'm going to show off. So we're going to start by transcribing a page of minutes from the Wednesday Club, which is a literary club in Sandy Springs, Maryland. And for this project, we're going to go way on back to 1983. So let's see if we can handle this cursive. We're going to start with January 12th. Oh, that's a hard one.
I was thinking Christie, but no, I agree, it's not that. A wife of a CNA, oh, CIA, oh.
I'm not going to transcribe the entire minute. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I made a mistake here. That's supposed to be an ampersand.
And there should be a period after lived, the very end.
Okay. And I need to add 1983 at the top. Okay. And do we actually think that's Coister?
I think it's maybe, I don't think it's an ER. It's maybe an IE at the end, Cloisty.
Okay. If anyone can read this one, let us know. So I'm going to, so this project is making use of a fairly advanced feature, which is the ability to add tags to things. Most projects don't use this, but I'm going to go ahead and flag this as unclear. I'm not sure about comely either. So let's save that. And one of the things we want to point out is that as we do this work, you can see we track every version of the page. So every time somebody transcribes something, every time somebody hits the save button, we track that. So you can see that on July 6th, the Sandy Spring Museum uploaded this. Then I transcribed the first version and you see my initial work with all of its errors. And then you see what we changed. So you can see adding the date and the ampersand, changing that from a star. I'm going to go back and add a note that I'm really not sure about the surnames here. Certainly somebody who's worked on this would be familiar with the people and would be able to do that.
Or even just someone local might know common local last names.
Right. So you see, I was able to add a note on the page. This is the stuff that I used to, when I mentioned us trying to associate the conversations about the text and about the image with the image, this is where that discussion happens. And we can see my note. We can actually see all notes. So we can see the kinds of conversations that happened. You can see people saying, oh, I'm not sure how to describe the lists, or, here's something weird I've seen, this is crossed out. And then if we dive in, we can actually look at those conversations and watch them happen. So you see a volunteer saying, here's all the challenges here. I need this to be reviewed by somebody. And we have this
actually the staff member.
It is okay. Yeah, somebody saying, you're doing great. This is going to be fantastic. And the volunteer says, thanks, I've enjoyed working on these. And so you can see what they did and where they left it, and then the work the staff member did. So it's a great kind of collaboration between the staff and the volunteers to make this more accessible. So these kinds of texts, as we mentioned, these narrative texts are not the only ones that we support. They're not the only kinds of records that archives tend to have. Another example, this is a set of marriage reports. They're not marriage certificates, but they're very similar to them that the Maryland State Archives has. And you can see this is not a narrative text, right? We're not asking people to type everything they see. The Maryland State Archives is just trying to create an index into the collection they'll be able to use themselves when answering researcher requests. So they are just asking for first, middle, and last name of the groom and bride. And they're able to set up fields to handle this kind of document and ask people to essentially index instead of transcribe.
These go really fast.
Yeah,
there's not very many fields.
and they're typewritten. There's one volunteer who works on this who's a very quick typist, and she is able to get through 100 pages an hour. It's kind of incredible. I'm actually kind of curious about the statistics on the project and see how many of these cards they've done.
It doesn't look like they only have 908 in this.
Only 908? Okay.
Unless we've got some hidden. But
Yeah, they might be. That's a good point. While we run those statistics, we should talk about another type of data format, which is also structured like the marriage certificates were. But rather than having one record per image, we have multiple records per image. So this is a project we host for the Swedish National Archives. It is the petition for the right to vote for women that was circulated in 1922. So you had this pre-printed form that was sent out and circulated among every little town and village in Sweden. And some huge proportion of the female population signed it. I forget whether it was 30% or 60%, but some absolutely enormous proportion of people. So the way that they've configured this project is as what we call a spreadsheet transcription project. So they start off with the kind of header fields on this page. So they're asking for the land name, which I guess is like county name, the place name, and the page number, which is stamped, because these are fields that apply to everything on the page. Then they've configured a spreadsheet with what I think is first name, last name, title, occupation, address, and then things I have no idea what those are. Apologies if somebody else has better Swedish than I do, maybe they can tell us. But people are transcribing these at a huge rate, but it is more difficult than, say, the Baltimore City marriages, right? This is, no one's doing 100 of these an hour, right? That's not really possible.
So the material is so dense.
Yeah.
But so useful to know who lived where in the years this was, and to know that your ancestor was, signed on to this. So
yeah. Any questions before I proceed? At this point, I think I've talked about most of the user-facing sides of the tool. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what project owners can see. We're going to look at a project that I run. So in addition to the standard splash page for the project that lists the works that need to be transcribed and the status, we also can see the statistics. There's a discussion forum where we can talk about things that we find. There is the ability to look at the collaborators who've been working on this. So for people who have volunteer hours required of them, perhaps students, you can pull out a spreadsheet that lists an approximation of how many hours different people worked on different things for this project. It's pretty straightforward to bring documents in. You can just upload zip files or PDF files. If you have a content management system that supports IIIF or are using the Internet Archive for content DM, we can bring those in directly onto the platform. And then, of course, you also want to get the data back out again. So pulling data out can be done in a number of different ways. we support PDF, Microsoft Word exports. We have all kinds of plain text or HTML exports. And then for all of the structured data, you really want to pull that out as spreadsheets that you can use for your own systems. So we support that as well.
And you can, for an entire collection, you can pull out a zip file that has as many of these as you need in one kind of thing. We background it and send you an email when it's ready. So lots of different ways to get stuff out. We try to make it as easy as possible to get things into from the page and to get your transcriptions out.
So that concludes the demo portion of this, but I'm happy to go back in and deep dive on anything. Are there any other questions or comments before we wrap up? Okay. Thank you for joining us, Robert. We really appreciate it. There was a question about AV possibilities. The software currently does not support that. We are discussing developing that sometime perhaps in 2025.
Yeah, it's going to be a little while, but
right. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. If you have specific project ideas, we're always happy to jump on a call and take a look at your material and think about how it might make sense to set that up on our system and how you might organize projects and plan them.
we really appreciate you all coming. We do.